Dakota Territory, 1880. While neighbors raced to throw up standard cabins before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Henriksen was still working in late September. Wind cut across the prairie as he positioned a black iron bucket, 16 inches wide, filled with 90 pounds of dry river sand directly on top of his cast iron stove. His neighbors called it wasteful. Storekeeper Elijah Stroud called him a fool, warning that the bucket would steal heat from the room and crack the stove under the weight. Everyone knew the rule: keep your stove glowing red hot all night, sleep with firewood in reach. Henriksen ignored them. He'd grown up beside kakelung tile stoves in Norway that heated homes for hours on a single firing. Each evening, he'd build one hot fire, let the sand bucket absorb the heat, then close the damper and let the flames die, while neighbor cabins burned wood all night long. Then October 15th arrived. The blizzard hit without warning, 3 feet of snow in a single day, 20 degrees below zero. The hard winter had begun. Standard cabins required constant stoking. Families took shifts feeding glowing stoves that devoured cord after cord of precious firewood. But in Henriksen's darkened cabin, with his fire long dead, that bucket of sand still radiated steady warmth at 4 in the morning, keeping the interior a full 10 to 15 degrees warmer than neighboring homes. What did this immigrant understand about heat, mass, and survival that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The iron bucket sat precisely where Lars Henriksen had placed it that September evening, dead center on the cast iron stovetop, its black surface still radiating warmth into the pre-dawn darkness of his Dakota Territory cabin. Outside, the thermometer nailed to his door frame read 20 degrees below zero, and a north wind piled snow against the log walls with the persistence of a living thing. In neighboring cabins scattered across the settlement, families huddled near cherry-red stoves, feeding them split oak and cottonwood every 45 minutes to keep the interior temperature above freezing. The sound of axe blades splitting kindling echoed through the thin walls at all hours, a rhythm as constant as breathing. But Henriksen's cabin held a different silence. His fire had died hours ago, the last coals raked beneath the iron bucket that held 90 pounds of dry river sand. The bucket measured 16 inches across and 14 inches deep, dimensions he had calculated not from engineering tables, but from childhood memory of the kakelung tile stoves that heated Norwegian farmhouses through sub-zero nights on a single firing, where his neighbors burned through armload after armload of precious wood, maintaining temperatures that swung from 75 degrees near the glowing stove to 32 degrees at the south far wall. His cabin held steady. The thermometer by his bed read 45 degrees, and the water bucket near the door showed only a thin skin of ice rather than the solid freeze that plagued other homes. Henriksen had arrived in Dakota Territory 3 years earlier, part of the massive wave of Scandinavian immigrants seeking land and freedom in the 1870s. He carried with him more than the usual collection of tools and determination. He possessed intimate knowledge of how dense materials stored and released heat, learned during childhood winters spent sleeping in the alcove bed beside a towering masonry heater. Those kakelung stoves, designed in the 18th century to fight chronic wood shortages, could squeeze maximum warmth from minimal fuel by storing heat in brick and tile masses that released their energy slowly through the night. His first Dakota winter had taught him harsh lessons about American frontier heating. Following local advice, he had purchased a standard cast iron box stove and operated it according to the wisdom every neighbor preached. Keep it roaring hot, sleep with a stick in hand to stoke the fire, except that a 12 by 16-foot cabin would be 75 degrees beside the stove and 40 degrees at the far bed. He burned through a full cord of wood every 3 weeks. 128 cubic feet of carefully split and stacked timber that represented days of backbreaking labor. By February, his woodpile had dwindled to scattered pieces, and he found himself burning fence rails and furniture scraps like families across the territory. That spring, walking the thawed creek beds to gather driftwood, he noticed how dry sand along the banks retained the day's warmth long after sunset, while the air above turned cold. The observation sparked a memory of his grandfather's words about thermal mass, how dense materials heat slowly, but release their energy slowly, unlike thin iron that glows red hot and cools to black within hours. If he could place enough mass directly on his stove, he reasoned with the practical logic of a mechanic, rather than the equations of an engineer, he might store excess heat from a hot evening burn and bleed it back throughout the night. The experiment began with a discarded 20-quart iron ash bucket purchased from the settlement's general store for $3, a significant expense that drew immediate questions from neighbors who stopped by his claim. He spent an entire day at the creek sifting river sand through a homemade screen to remove organic matter and stones, then oven drying the sand to eliminate moisture that would create steam and condensation inside his cabin. The bucket, when filled, contained roughly 7/10 of a cubic foot of dense, dry sand weighing approximately 90 pounds. His first test burn revealed the system's potential. With a strong hardwood fire built from seasoned oak splits, his stovetop reached 450 degrees by 9 o'clock in the evening, while the bucket's surface heated to around 250 degrees. He closed the damper, let the fire die to coals, and went to bed without the night feeding that defined winter survival for every other family in the settlement. By 4 in the morning, the stovetop had cooled to ambient temperature, but the bucket still registered 120 degrees on the old meat thermometer he pressed against its side, warm enough to provide gentle, radiant heat that kept the cabin's air from dropping below the low 40s. The mockery began almost immediately. Tom Kelly, whose cabin stood a quarter-mile east, dropped by during the first week of testing and stared at the bucket with undisguised amazement. "Plan to cook sand porridge for breakfast?" he asked, shaking his head at what seemed like obvious foolishness. "You're robbing the stove of heat. That iron needs to glow, or you'll freeze come January." Other neighbors offered similar wisdom, some tinged with humor, others with genuine concern for a man they considered dangerously naive about prairie winters. The criticism grew more pointed when Elijah Stroud, the settlement's storekeeper and unofficial authority on heating equipment, made his rounds in early October. Stroud sold cast iron stoves shipped in by rail and considered himself expert on their proper operation based on factory literature and conversations with traveling salesmen. He examined Henrikson's setup with the confidence of a man who had never spent a childhood winter beside a masonry heater, warning that the bucket's weight would crack the stovetop, and that placing mass on the heating surface was wasted effort that prevented proper heat circulation. "Might as well haul rocks into the house if you're that lonely for company," he declared, a phrase that spread through the settlement and became the standard joke about the Norwegian's eccentricity. But Henriksen kept careful records in a small notebook, logging 3 critical measurements that told a different story than the joke suggested. Interior temperature at dawn without the bucket averaged 32 to 35 degrees, cold enough that water froze and breath fogged in front of faces. With the bucket in place, the same measurement consistently showed 42 to 45 degrees, a 10-degree gain that meant the difference between numbed fingers and functional hands for morning chores. Night wood consumption dropped from 3 armloads to 2 per evening, a reduction that projected to nearly 1 full quart of savings per month during deep winter. Most importantly, his estimated total winter fuel needs fell from the 6 to 7 cords that standard practice required to just over 4 cords, a difference that could mean survival when snow-blocked supply lines and fuel prices spiked to famine levels. As October's early blizzards gave way to the deeper cold of November, Henriksen made final preparations with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the mathematics of heat storage. He chinked every gap in his cabin walls with mud and straw, hung quilts over the door and windows for extra insulation, and stacked his reduced but adequate wood supply with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much fuel his method required. His neighbors hurried to finish less efficient cabins, confident that any decent stove would carry them through whatever winter might bring, unaware that the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 would test every assumption about heating, fuel, and survival on the Dakota prairie. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 announced itself with an October blizzard that buried the settlement under 3 feet of snow and choked the railroad lines that carried coal and supplies into Dakota territory. What began as an early storm became a pattern of relentless weather that would isolate communities for months, forcing families to survive on whatever fuel and provisions they had managed to stockpile during the brief autumn harvest season. Daytime temperatures rarely climbed above 0 degrees Fahrenheit, while nights plunged to 20 and 30 degrees below, accompanied by prairie winds that found every crack and gap in hastily built cabins. In the settlement's scattered homesteads, two distinct approaches to winter heating created a stark contrast visible to anyone willing to venture outside during the worst weather. Standard cabins glowed with the orange light of open stove doors and cherry red heating surfaces, their occupants crowded within arm's reach of the fire while children took turns feeding split wood into hungry fireboxes. The sound of axes splitting kindling echoed through the night, as someone in each household maintained the vigil required to keep temperatures above freezing. By midnight, fathers and older sons would rise to stoke dying fires, and by dawn, despite continuous tending, most cabins registered between 30 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, with water buckets skimmed in ice and frost coating the interior walls. Henriksen's cabin followed a different rhythm altogether. Each evening by 8 o'clock, he completed his final firing of the day, building a hot, clean burn from seasoned hardwood splits that brought his stovetop to 450 degrees and heated the 90-pound sand bucket to approximately 260 degrees. He would then close the draft controls, allowing the fire to die naturally while the dense mass above the stove absorbed and stored the remaining thermal energy. The cabin darkened as neighbors' homes blazed with continuous light, but the iron bucket continued radiating steady warmth throughout the night, maintaining interior temperatures that rarely dropped below 44 degrees even during the coldest snaps. The measurable differences between these heating methods became more pronounced as November's bitter cold gave way to December's sustained freeze. Over the first 30 days of serious winter weather, neighboring cabins consumed approximately 1.5 cords of wood each, burning through their carefully gathered fuel at a rate that projected to 6 or 7 cords for the entire winter season. Henriksen's consumption totaled just 1 cord during the same period, achieved through his disciplined schedule of 2 hot, efficient burns per day, rather than the continuous low fire that neighbors considered essential for survival. Where standard practice called for smoldering fires that drew enormous amounts of indoor air up the chimney and pulled frigid drafts through every unsealed crack, his method burned small amounts of wood completely and cleanly, depositing less creosote in the chimney while extracting maximum heat from each split log. The technical principles behind this dramatic difference in efficiency became clear to anyone willing to observe rather than dismiss. Thermal mass, dense materials like brick, stone, and sand, possess the ability to store large amounts of heat energy when warmed and release it slowly over many hours. The 90 pounds of sand in Henriksen's bucket, when heated through a temperature rise of 200 degrees, stored approximately 4,000 British thermal units of energy, enough to noticeably slow the cooling of a small, well-sealed cabin for 6 to 8 hours after the fire died. By concentrating this mass directly on the stove's heating surface, he had effectively transformed a thin cast iron heater into a miniature version of the masonry stoves that Scandinavian builders had perfected over centuries of fuel-scarce winters. As coal prices at Stroud's General Store climbed 25 to 30% above normal rates and cut wood became increasingly scarce, neighbors began paying closer attention to the quiet efficiency of the sand bucket system. The same men who had joked about heating sand instead of people now watched with growing concern as their own fuel supplies dwindled, while Henriksen made fewer trips to his woodpile. The social pressure that had once focused on mocking his unconventional methods shifted toward a more pointed criticism that blamed his success on selfishness rather than superior technique. Stroud intensified his opposition to the bucket system, claiming that the added weight would inevitably crack stovetops, and that placing mass on the heating surface prevented proper heat circulation throughout the cabin. His warnings carried the authority of a man who sold heating equipment for a living and understood the mechanical specifications printed in factory catalogs, but they revealed a fundamental ignorance of thermal mass principles that European stove builders had documented for generations. Henriksen quietly modified his setup anyway, placing 2 flat fire bricks under the bucket to distribute the load across a wider area of the stove top and adding a smaller pan filled with sand on the oven plate to provide cooking, heat during morning meal preparation. These adjustments only increased the mockery he faced during his weekly trips to the general store and church services. He had become known throughout the settlement as the man who heats sand instead of his house, a characterization that suggested either dangerous ignorance or deliberate eccentricity. Yet the notebook he kept by his bedside told a different story through careful measurements taken every morning at dawn. His cabin consistently maintained temperatures 10 to 15 degrees warmer than neighboring homes, used approximately 40% less fuel during comparable weather periods, and required no night tending that disrupted sleep and exhausted family members over the long winter months. By January, when repeated blizzards had effectively cut the settlement off from outside supply lines, these small advantages in fuel efficiency and interior comfort began to assume life or death significance. Families who had stockpiled 3 to 4 cords of wood while counting on store-bought coal to fill the gap found themselves facing the possibility of running out of fuel entirely. The railroad remained blocked, coal deliveries had ceased, and lumber prices spiked to levels that forced some households to burn furniture, fence rails, and twisted prairie grass to keep their stoves operating. Children slept in shifts with their parents to ensure someone was always awake to tend the fire, and the physical and mental exhaustion of continuous heating began taking its toll on families who had never imagined that their standard methods might prove inadequate. As temperatures dropped toward 30 degrees below zero during the worst cold snaps of the winter, the fundamental flaws in conventional heating practice became impossible to ignore. Thin cast-iron stoves glowed red-hot under continuous firing, warping heating plates and cracking enamel surfaces from thermal stress. The constant draft required to maintain combustion pulled enormous volumes of heated indoor air up the chimney, creating powerful suction that drew frigid outside air through every unsealed joint and crack in cabin construction. One neighbor's 14 by 18-foot cabin, built with board walls and poor chinking, never rose above 40 degrees more than a few feet from the stove, even when the firebox blazed at maximum capacity, creating dangerous temperature gradients that left sleeping areas dangerously cold, while the stove area became almost unbearably hot. The fuel crisis reached its breaking point on January 15th, when the third blizzard in 10 days buried the railroad tracks under drifts higher than locomotive smokestacks, effectively cutting off all coal deliveries to settlements across the territory. Towns that had counted on regular freight shipments to supplement their wood supplies now faced the stark reality of surviving on whatever fuel they had managed to stockpile before winter's grip tightened. Store-bought coal vanished entirely from Stroud shelves, and the price of cut wood climbed to levels that forced families to choose between heating and eating. Some households began burning chair legs and table planks, while others twisted prairie grass into tight bundles that provided brief, smoky heat, but left behind more ash than warmth. The mathematics of survival became brutally clear as January's cold deepened into February's sustained freeze. Standard cabin families had projected needing 6 to 7 cords of wood to survive the winter, but many had stockpiled only 3 to 4 cords while depending on coal purchases and milder weather to fill the gap. With outside temperatures holding steady at 25 degrees below zero and no prospect of supply line restoration, every split log became as valuable as currency. Henriksen's 5 cords of stacked wood, supplemented by scattered windbreak trees he could harvest from his own claim, represented abundance compared to neighbors who faced the very real possibility of freezing to death in their own homes. The structural failures of conventional heating practice compounded as the crisis intensified. Tom Kelly's cabin, built with standard 14 by 18-foot dimensions and board wall construction, became a laboratory for the limits of continuous firing. Even with his cast-iron cook stove glowing cherry red and consuming wood at a rate that devoured his entire stockpile within weeks, the interior temperature never climbed above 40 degrees more than 6 feet from the heating source. His children huddled in blankets beside the stove, while ice formed on the cabin walls just 10 feet away, creating a microclimate so severe that water froze solid in cups left on the kitchen table overnight. The exhaustion of round-the-clock fire tending began breaking down family structures across the settlement. Parents and older children divided the night into shifts, ensuring someone remained awake every 2 hours to feed hungry stoves that seemed to consume more fuel with each passing day. Sleep deprivation combined with the constant stress of rationing dwindling wood supplies created a desperation that manifested in increasingly dangerous heating decisions. Several families began burning green wood that produced more smoke than heat, while others overloaded their stoves with whatever combustible material they could find, creating fire hazards that threatened to burn down the very shelters they struggled to keep warm. Henriksen's response to the deepening crisis demonstrated the sustained advantages of thermal mass heating under extreme conditions. While neighbors fed continuous fires throughout each 24-hour period, he maintained his disciplined schedule of 2 hot burns per day using smaller, carefully selected hardwood splits that burned completely and efficiently. His morning fire began at 6 o'clock with dry oak and ash pieces, building to maximum heat within 30 minutes before the sand bucket absorbed the thermal energy and allowed the fire to die naturally. The evening burn followed the same pattern, creating a cycle that heated the bucket to temperatures approaching 300 degrees twice daily while consuming far less wood than the smoldering fires that neighbors considered essential for survival. Over a 48-hour period during the worst storm of the winter, when temperatures dropped to 35 degrees below zero and winds reached sustained speeds of 40 miles per hour, the contrast between heating methods became a matter of documented survival statistics. Henriksen consumed approximately 2/10 of a cord of wood, roughly 25 cubic feet of tightly stacked splits, while maintaining cabin temperatures that peaked around 70 degrees near the stove after each firing and never dropped below 46 degrees at the farthest sleeping area. Tom Kelly's family, following standard practice in a cabin of similar size and construction, burned through nearly 4/10 of a cord during the same storm period while watching their interior temperature swing from 75 degrees beside the glowing stove to 28 degrees at the far wall just before dawn. The crisis reached its most dangerous point on the night of February 3rd, when Kelly's stovepipe joint failed after 18 hours of continuous high-temperature operation. The cast iron connector, weakened by repeated thermal expansion and contraction, separated at the elbow joint and began filling the cabin with dense wood smoke that made breathing impossible within minutes. Kelly had no choice but to dump his carefully maintained fire into a metal bucket and carry it outside, then open the cabin door to clear the poisonous atmosphere while temperatures stood at 30 degrees below zero. The brief exposure to outside air chilled his infant daughter to the point of hypothermia and froze their water supply into a solid block of ice that would require hours of careful thawing near a rebuilt fire. Desperate and nearly frozen, the Kelly family stumbled through the storm toward the only light visible across the snow-covered prairie. They expected to find Henriksen in the same desperate condition that plagued every other household in the settlement, huddled beside a roaring fire and burning through his fuel reserves at an unsustainable rate. Instead, they discovered a cabin heated by what seemed like impossible physics. The stovetop was cold to the touch, with no visible coals remaining in the firebox, yet the interior air held steady at 52 degrees, while the iron bucket above the dead stove radiated gentle warmth that kept frost from forming on the windows and prevented their breath from fogging in the still air. The visual contrast struck the Kelly family with the force of revelation. 2 cabins of nearly identical construction, exposed to the same killing storm, using wood from the same timber sources, yet producing entirely different outcomes for human survival. One relied on continuous, inefficient burning that consumed enormous amounts of fuel while creating dangerous temperature gradients and mechanical failures. The other depended on stored thermal energy from dense mass that provided steady, reliable heat without the constant attention and fuel consumption that exhausted families and depleted wood supplies. One family faced potential death from exposure and smoke inhalation, while the other slept soundly through the worst weather of the winter, with their heating system requiring no intervention between evening shutdown and morning startup. Word of the failed pipe joint and emergency shelter spread through the settlement within days, carried by neighbors who could no longer dismiss the sand bucket as harmless eccentricity. Henriksen quietly began sharing his method with families whose fuel supplies had reached critical levels, loaning small amounts of wood while teaching the principles of thermal mass heating and air sealing. He helped the Kellys set up a 50-pound sand container on their repaired stove and documented the immediate results. Nighttime low temperatures rose from 30 degrees to 40 degrees, and wood consumption dropped by 25% over the following 10 days of testing. The April thaw of 1881 arrived with the sudden violence of prairie weather, transforming months of accumulated snow into rushing torrents that carved new channels across the landscape and finally reopened the railroad lines that connected isolated settlements to the outside world. As families emerged from cabins that had become virtual prisons during the longest winter in territorial memory, the accounting of survival began with the methodical precision of people who had learned to measure everything in terms of fuel, warmth, and life itself. Stroud's General Store Ledger provided the stark mathematics of the crisis, documenting fuel purchases that revealed how close many households had come to freezing in their own homes. The settlement's fuel consumption records, meticulously kept by families who had learned to count every stick of wood, painted a clear picture of two fundamentally different approaches to winter survival. The average household had consumed between 5 and 7 cords of wood equivalent during the siege, much of it purchased at crisis prices that reached 3 times normal rates when supply lines reopened in March. At least 4 families had been forced to abandon their claims temporarily, moving into town when their fuel supplies ran out entirely and emergency purchases became impossible. 2 households had burned through their reserve heating fuel so completely that they resorted to dismantling interior walls and furniture to feed stoves during the final weeks of February. Henrikson's fuel log told a dramatically different story. His total winter consumption measured just over 4 cords of seasoned hardwood, with nearly a full cord remaining in his carefully organized woodpile when the snow finally began its retreat. More significantly, he had purchased no emergency fuel at inflated prices and had actually loaned wood to 3 neighboring families during the worst weeks of the blockade. His notebook recorded the precise measurements that explained this seemingly impossible efficiency. Average nighttime low temperatures of 46 degrees compared to 32 degrees in standard cabins, daytime heating costs reduced by 40% through thermal mass storage, and complete elimination of night firing that had exhausted other families throughout the winter. The health outcomes across the settlement provided additional evidence of the sand bucket system's effectiveness during extreme conditions. Families who had adopted Henrikson's method, even in modified forms, reported significantly fewer cases of severe respiratory illness among their children compared to households that had struggled with inadequately heated cabins and continuous wood smoke exposure. The Kelly family, who had implemented a partial thermal mass system after their February crisis, noted that their infant daughter had suffered no further cold-related health problems despite being born during the worst winter weather on record. The social transformation that followed the crisis represented a complete reversal of the mockery and skepticism that had greeted Henrikson's unconventional heating approach just months earlier. The April church meeting, held in the settlement's one-room schoolhouse, became an impromptu technical conference as families shared their winter experiences and sought practical advice for the following year's preparations. Stroud himself, whose opposition to the sand bucket had been the most vocal and persistent, now asked detailed questions about bucket dimensions, sand weight calculations, and optimal placement relative to stove surfaces. The storekeeper's conversion from skeptic to advocate reflected a broader recognition that frontier heating wisdom had failed its most crucial test. His standard advice about continuous firing and red-hot stove surfaces had proven not just inefficient, but potentially deadly when fuel supplies became limited and temperatures dropped below the tolerance of standard cabin construction. The factory literature and traveling salesman recommendations that had formed the basis of his expertise contained no guidance for surviving extended cold snaps with limited fuel, leaving families to discover through near-fatal experience that their heating methods were fundamentally inadequate for prairie winters. Henrikson's willingness to share his knowledge freely accelerated the adoption of thermal mass principles throughout the settlement. He provided precise specifications that families could implement with materials available locally: iron buckets or large pans holding between 50 and 90 pounds of dry sand, positioned directly on stove, surfaces and supported by fire bricks to distribute weight safely. His firing schedule became the new standard for families who had previously maintained continuous burns: 2 hot, efficient fires per day using seasoned hardwood, with complete combustion and thermal mass charging replacing the wasteful smoldering that had characterized traditional practice. The technical discussions that emerged from these teaching sessions revealed the depth of traditional knowledge that Henriksen had brought from his Norwegian childhood. He explained the principles behind masonry heating without using engineering terminology, describing how dense materials absorbed heat energy during hot firing and released it slowly over many hours. His comparisons between American cast iron stoves and European tile stoves provided context for understanding why frontier heating methods had developed along inefficient lines, driven by the apparent abundance of wood resources and the temporary nature of early homestead construction. Within 2 years, variations of the sand bucket system had become standard practice throughout the settlement and surrounding claims. Some families built partial masonry walls behind their stoves, filling the spaces with sand or small stones to create larger thermal mass installations. Others experimented with multiple sand containers of different sizes, creating heating systems that could store thermal energy for 12 to 16 hours after firing stopped. The most successful adaptations combined the basic sand bucket principle with improved cabin construction, using better chinking, double wall construction, and strategic placement of thermal mass to create heating systems that required minimal fuel while maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the coldest weather. The storekeeper began stocking iron buckets and sand screening equipment as standard winter preparation supplies, acknowledging through his inventory choices that the foolish heating method had proven superior to conventional wisdom. His conversations with customers shifted from promoting continuous firing to explaining thermal mass principles, and his store became an informal center for sharing technical improvements and refinements to the basic system. The railroad brought occasional visitors who marveled at the settlement's low wood consumption and comfortable cabin temperatures, spreading word of the Dakota sand bucket method to other frontier communities facing similar heating challenges. By 1883, when the territorial government began documenting successful homestead practices for distribution to new settlers, Henriksen's thermal mass heating approach had been formally recognized as a proven survival technique for extreme prairie winters. The official recommendations included detailed instructions for sand bucket construction, optimal firing schedules, and cabin modifications that maximized the effectiveness of stored heat systems. What had begun as one immigrant's adaptation of Old World knowledge to New World conditions had evolved into documented best practice, vindicated not through theory, but through the ultimate test of keeping families alive during the harshest winter conditions the American frontier could produce. Decades later, Anna Henriksen Risdal would describe to her own grandchildren the distinctive sound that marked winter evenings in her grandfather's cabin, not the constant splitting of kindling that characterized other prairie homes, but the gentle settling of sand in an iron bucket as thermal expansion and contraction created barely audible shifts in the mass that had kept her family alive during the hard winter. These family stories, preserved in the letters and church histories that Scandinavian communities across the upper Midwest maintained with meticulous care, became part of a larger pattern of traditional knowledge transmission that connected Old World heating wisdom to New World survival techniques. The intergenerational memory of the sand bucket method spread through informal networks that followed kinship lines and ethnic settlement patterns across Dakota Territory and beyond. Norwegian and Swedish immigrants who had witnessed Henriksen's success during the 1880 to 1881 winter carried the technique to homesteads throughout Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the territories that would become North and South Dakota. Letters written in careful English and preserved Norwegian script documented the practical details that made the difference between survival and disaster: bucket dimensions, sand preparation methods, firing schedules, and cabin modifications that maximized the effectiveness of stored thermal mass. The technique evolved and refined itself as it spread across the upper Great Plains, adapting to different cabin sizes, stove types, and local materials while maintaining the core principle of dense mass storage and slow heat release. Families with access to good clay began experimenting with thick-walled ceramic containers that held heat even longer than iron buckets, while those near stone quarries built permanent masonry masses behind their stoves. The basic physics remained constant. Materials with high thermal capacity could absorb large amounts of heat energy and release it slowly over many hours, but the implementation varied according to resources and construction skills available in different settlements. By the 1890s, formal documentation of high-efficiency heating methods began appearing in agricultural extension publications and territorial government guides for new homesteaders. The University of Minnesota's Agricultural Experiment Station published detailed studies comparing fuel consumption rates between different heating approaches, confirming through controlled measurements what prairie families had learned through necessity. Thermal mass systems consistently reduced winter fuel requirements by 30 to 40% while maintaining more stable interior temperatures than continuous firing methods, validating the empirical observations that had driven adoption across frontier communities. The connection between frontier innovation and old world traditions became explicit as more permanent farmhouses replaced the hastily built cabins of early settlement. Scandinavian communities with sufficient resources began installing full masonry heaters based on kakelugn and other traditional European designs, creating heating systems that could maintain comfortable temperatures throughout large homes on just 1 or 2 fires per day. These installations, built by stonemasons who had learned their craft in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, demonstrated the same thermal mass principles that Henriksen had improvised with his iron bucket and 90 pounds of river sand. The architectural evidence of this evolution remains visible today in the farmhouses and town homes that dot the upper Midwest, where massive brick and tile stoves rise through multiple floors and terminate in distinctive chimneys designed to extract maximum heat from wood smoke before venting to the outside. Local historical societies preserve detailed documentation of these installations, including construction techniques, firing procedures, and fuel consumption records that confirm their remarkable efficiency compared to the cast iron stoves that dominated American heating practice during the same period. The scientific vindication of thermal mass heating principles accelerated during the 20th century as engineers and energy researchers began quantifying heat storage and release mechanisms with precision instruments and mathematical modeling. University studies confirmed that dense materials like sand, stone, and ceramic could store between 800 and 1,500 British thermal units per cubic foot when heated through temperature differentials of 200 degrees, making them highly effective thermal batteries for residential heating applications. The physics that Henriksen had understood through childhood observation and practical experimentation became the subject of formal research that validated traditional knowledge through modern measurement techniques. Contemporary interest in thermal mass heating has experienced a remarkable revival as energy costs and environmental concerns drive renewed attention to high-efficiency wood-burning systems. Off-grid homesteaders and sustainable living advocates regularly discuss the same basic technique that saved lives on the Dakota Prairie, filling metal containers with sand or stone and placing them on wood stoves to capture and slowly release thermal energy throughout the night. Online forums and instructional videos demonstrate bucket placement, sand preparation, and firing schedules that differ only in detail from the methods Henriksen developed through trial and observation during the 1880s. Modern engineers have scaled these principles to industrial applications through experimental sand battery systems that store renewable energy in massive containers holding hundreds of tons of heated sand. These installations can maintain temperatures of 400 to 600 degrees Celsius for months, releasing stored energy for community heating when solar and wind power production drops below demand levels. The fundamental concept remains identical to Henriksen's frontier innovation. Dense materials heated by available energy sources can store and release thermal energy more efficiently than systems that require continuous fuel input. The technical documentation that supports modern thermal mass heating consistently references the same principles that made the difference between survival and death during the hard winter. Heat capacity, thermal conductivity, and energy storage density determine the effectiveness of any thermal mass system, whether measured in British thermal units per pound or in the practical terms of cabin temperature at dawn after a long winter night. The bucket of sand that neighbors mocked in 1880 now appears in engineering literature as a proven example of appropriate technology that solved complex energy storage problems using locally available materials and traditional knowledge. Yet the deeper lesson of Henriksen's story extends beyond technical validation to encompass the broader relationship between conventional wisdom and practical innovation under extreme conditions. When accepted methods failed their ultimate test during the worst winter in territorial memory, survival belonged to those who understood fundamental principles rather than following standard practice. The immigrant who heated sand instead of people possessed knowledge that transcended cultural boundaries and technological limitations, demonstrating that effective solutions often emerge from understanding natural laws rather than accepting inherited assumptions about how things should be done. The final image that closes this account returns to the scene that defined winter survival for one Dakota Territory family: a darkened cabin where the fire had died hours ago, a bucket of sand still radiating gentle warmth in the pre-dawn cold, and children sleeping comfortably in beds that remained above freezing throughout the longest nights of the frontier's harshest winter. In a landscape where neighbors' cabins glowed with continuous fires that consumed cord after cord of precious wood, the quiet efficiency of stored thermal energy had proved that sometimes the most effective technology is also the simplest, requiring only the wisdom to recognize that heat, like hope, is best preserved through patience rather than desperation.